In today's video, we're continuing our NHL offseason plan series. Today, we're looking at the 11th best team from the NHL's regular season, the New York Islanders. What moves do we expect from them this offseason? We'll discuss all that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we're doing the off-season plan series today for the New York Islanders. If you're new to this series, we started at the 31st ranked team. We're working our way all the way up to number 1, going through all these teams with a dedicated video discussing what moves we're going to see from these teams as the offseason gets into high gear. So first, we're going to recap the 1920 season, take a look at what they have for cap space, expiring contracts, and discuss what trades or signings we should expect from this franchise, or at least what they should be doing, in my opinion, this offseason. So let's kick things off with a recap of the 1920 season for those New York Islanders. So as you can see here, the Islanders had a pretty solid season, finishing with 35, 23, and 10 for 80 points. Of course, had no problem qualifying for the NHL Stanley Cup Playoffs, which was a little bit different this year, of course, as we know. But still, the Islanders had a great run, falling to the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Eastern Conference Finals. So they not only made the playoffs for the second year in a row, but they made some progress as well as far as how deep they went. So clearly this team is a team on the rise, but certainly still has a few glaring needs to really take it up another level. And we'll discuss that a little bit further and what I feel they need to do to make that happen. Now, taking a look at their individual team stats, you can see they scored 192 goals while giving up 193 for a -1 overall team rating, which really, if you think about it, is not great considering how good they did as a team. Like, this goes to show that they need to score more. I mean, defensively, they're one of the better teams in the NHL. Barry Trotz's system is very sound. When they stick to their system, they are difficult to play against and difficult to generate offense against. But this team needs to add more goals to their repertoire before they can really be a more legitimate cup contender, in my opinion. Now, let's take a look at special teams, where we saw a power play click at only 17.3% for 24th best, so that's clearly something that needs to be improved upon. They need an extra offensive weapon, in my opinion, that can really be a bit of a power play specialist to take advantage of more of those opportunities. The penalty killing, I'm surprised, wasn't better, considering how good they are as a team defensively. I thought they might be a better PK team this current year, but they did do well. Nothing to be ashamed of by any means. At 80.7%, 15th best in the NHL, but that's really only average in the middle of the pack there. I think they can even take that up another notch heading into next year as well. Now let's take a look at what they have for cap space as of today and expiring contracts for RFAs and UFAs, and determine what we think they're going to do with those players. Now, as you can see here from CapFriendly.com, the Islanders currently, as of right now, have $8.9 million in salary cap space available. Now, of course, that could change if anybody on their roster could qualify or end up going a long-term injury reserve. We've seen players like Andrew Ladd, for example, have a fair bit of time on that as of late, but as of right now, we have no reason to believe for sure that he would go on that. But of course, that would be the only other thing that right now, at least, that would impact that available space, of course, barring any trades or change of player personnel. Now, they also have 20 players under contract for that amount of money, which means they only really need about 2 or 3 players signed to make up the difference here to have a full roster. But as of right now on Cap Friendly, those 20 players, some of those guys may not be, the guys who would make the roster next year. Some of them could be younger players, etc. So let's take a look now at who is on expiring contracts. Who are the restricted free agents and unrestricted free agents that either need to be signed or replaced? Now, the list of UFAs is not anything too serious, and they are something that they do need to take a look at, but some of these they already have the answers for. Like, for example, we have Matt Martin. I would not be surprised if he's brought back on a shorter term, relatively inexpensive deal. Martin's been a pretty good piece for them on their fourth line, and like I said, wouldn't be surprised to see him come back. You got Tom Kuhnhackl, who I think likely doesn't get signed. You get Derek Brassard, who maybe could get signed, but he's even been a healthy scratch at times during the playoffs. I think they can probably let him go. They don't have a ton of money here to work with, given some of these other RFAs we're going to look at in a second. So I think the odds of Brassard getting signed are pretty slim, and I think basically after they acquired Pajot especially, they're pretty solid down the middle. They don't really need Brassard any longer here, in my opinion. Now, they also have Andy Green, who was acquired from New Jersey. Of course, a player that Lou Lamoriello very familiar with. I probably would be surprised if he signed, but at the same time, maybe they work something out. He could be a depth piece for them. He did play decent through the playoffs, so we'll see, but it's by no means a given that he's back. And of course, you have goaltender Thomas Greiss. And as great as Greiss has been the last couple of years, there's no way he's coming back. They have their goaltending situation already figured out. He has been essentially replaced by youngster Ilya Sorokin, who is looked upon as being the goalie of the future. And of course, his fellow Russian goaltender, Semyon Varlamov, who was really solid during his time in the playoffs as well, will be his mentor as they develop him to be their future #1 star starting goaltender. So Greiss definitely will be hitting the market, and there will be no shortage of interest, I'm sure. Now on the RFA front, this is where it gets really interesting because their top player, top offensive weapon, Matthew Barzal, needs a new contract, and many feel that this contract could be somewhat of a market-setting deal for the remainder of other RFAs that have had solid young careers so far as well. Barzal certainly going to be commanding a lot of money, and it's difficult to say what kind of agreement could be reached. You've also got a couple of pretty important defensemen, Ryan Pulock and Devon Toews, and then you have to wonder here, with those three players alone, there's no way they have enough money right now available to pay those three players. Barzal alone could take up that full amount of cap space, maybe even a little bit more than that. So they're going to have to find ways to trim salary. They're not going to have any choice but to move out a couple of players. Difficult to say exactly who that is. We'll get into that here momentarily. But you have to wonder, though, if that's going to put them to be at risk of an offer sheet target by other competing teams here that would love to get one of those players on their team. Now let's take a look now at what we call the burning questions around this franchise, and we'll segue right into that. The top one is the RFAs and the offer sheet threat. Now the threat, I do believe, is real. I think the two teams that are most likely to be picked on if there are offer sheets this year would be the Islanders and Tampa Bay. Now, of course, mainly because they have so little space and such important players to pay, they have no choice but to move money out. And that's going to prove to be somewhat challenging in a salary cap that's flat. And there's not a lot of teams with a ton of money that's available here that they can kind of take those on. There are some teams, but of course you have to offer them the right sweet package to make them want to help you out. Now, of course, a couple of key players that could be on the way out if they find the right deal would be a guy like Andrew Ladd or Johnny Boychuk. Prime targets right there. Those two players make a combined over $11 million. Even if they could move one of them would be a massive help to the overall cap situation. They have 8.1 right now. If they could get an extra 5 or 6, then that would probably be a situation where they could satisfy things. I mean, coming into this season, I would have thought for sure Barzal would have won a long-term contract for some pretty big money, like a 7 or 8 year deal, somewhere between 8 and 10 million would have been what I predicted, a long time ago when the season first started, which is really like almost a calendar year now, considering where we're at with everything. But obviously, things are different now. The money is not going to be as plentiful as it used to be, so it might be more likely that he take a shorter-term contract, maybe somewhere in that 4 to 5 year range. Of course, they're going to have to examine what his status will be at the end of the contract, if he's still an RFA or UFA. Once you have 7 years in, you can be an unrestricted free agent. So are they going to buy up any of those UFA years? Will they do a shorter-term deal so he's still an RFA at the end? They have to decide all that, and that's going to determine what kind of money we're talking about here. But no matter how you shake it, they're really tight on space, and I don't see Barzal really giving them much of a break on what they expect for. Many NHL insiders and reporters feel the top players will still get the top dollar, which essentially is just going to take away more from the guys that are your bottom 6 forwards, your third pair defensemen, your backup goaltenders, etc. They will get less. The top players will get more. Unfortunately, that's just the way the league is trending right now, especially with a lot of these teams. So the Islanders need to find space so they can actually, protect themselves from an offer sheet threat, because we saw one last year for the first time in a long time. There's some teams out there with the space and the draft picks who would be primed to do that. So I think they would have an easier time protecting Pulock and Toews. Those probably will take shorter-term bridge deals. It's the Barzal contract that you have to be more concerned about. So we'll see what happens, but those contracts are going to be, precedent-setting for the rest of the RFA field, especially the Barzal deal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this team, along with what it already has, really could use an extra offensive weapon. They need to be able to score more goals, and they're going to have to do this via trade because there's just no space to keep what they have and to bring something else in. So who goes out? I mean, you're looking at the forward group, it's going to have to be something more significant. I mean, we saw Jordan Eberle not really have a great playoff run. Would they consider moving him? You get Anders Lee, you got Brock Nelson, you got Josh Bailey. It's unlikely that you'd really want to trade any of those guys. But you need a more offensive weapon. They were really, really close last offseason to getting Artemi Panarin, and a player like that is exactly what they need. They need another game breaker who can play with Barzal. They're going to take both of them up another level here. I mean, there's lots of players out there that are, fit that mold that are reportedly available for trade. We're talking guys like Patrick Laine in Winnipeg might be available. You got Johnny Gaudreau in Calgary might be available. And there's others out there as well. So the Islanders and Lou Lamoriello need to be creative on how they can bring in another offensive threat. Either that or they need to change how they play to be more offensive because they're just not scoring enough. And that's the big difference here. When they got up to a team against Tampa, they just couldn't compete. So I'm not sure how they do it, but it's certainly right up near the top of the list right after getting Barzal locked up on a new contract. Now, to help with that as well, they could certainly look to revamp their blue line a little bit. Like I said, we could have guys like Johnny Boychuk or maybe even Nick Leddy moved out to create some necessary space. I mean, Leddy's probably less likely to go, but if they can move on from Boychuk, I mean, they still have Scott Mayfield on a long-term contract. That's relatively team friendly. You've got Pulock needs a new deal. You get Pelech back there. You've also got some youngsters like Noah Dobson who should be able to step in with a bigger role. So you get the future of Andy Green's uncertain. If they can move on from that Thomas Hickey contract as well, and they could end up being buried in the minors next year. They could get an extra $1 million of cap relief off of that as well. So there's another bit of savings if they can't find a taker for Thomas Hickey. So that's another thing that they can do. It's not a ton of space extra, but every little bit helps at this point. But they need to figure out ways to get Noah Dobson more time, and even some others as well, because they can get a few more players on entry-level contracts that will obviously offset some of the bigger contracts if they can swap some players in and out. So we're looking at some other prospects like an Oliver Wahlstrom or Kiefer Bellows. Can they finally take a step up here and take a bigger role with the team on a more of a full-time basis? Will they finally move on from Josh Hosang? I mean, he's not really doing much of anything, so he's not really much of a distraction, but you would think that the organization would like to finally be moved on from him as well. And of course, like I said, we already know who the goaltenders are going to be next year. You got Sorokin, who's going to be mentored by Varlamov, so they're pretty solid in that regard. So they really can take care of most of their business in-house. But they need to talk to teams like Ottawa, like Detroit, like Buffalo that have a way more available cap space right now, have more flexibility to see if they can move some of this dead weight contracts. Because if they could find an extra $5 or $6 million in cap space, will go a long ways here to at least get their RFA signed. If they want to try to add something else to create more offense, then something more significant as well is going to have to go out. So let me know your thoughts on what kind of trade scenarios can the Islanders look at to become a more offensive team next year. They don't want to really change too much about how they play because obviously it's led to a lot of success. But they need to find more ways to put more pucks in the net here to have a more legit shot at being a cup contender. Let me know your thoughts on the Islanders' offseason plans down in the comments and we can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And stay tuned for the remainder of this series coming here very soon. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.